Hello and welcome. My name is Patrick, and this channel is all about the history of medicine. I'm not a historian or a doctor, I just love this stuff. And over the years, I've read dozens of books and academic articles about the field. Sometimes I adapt these books into videos for this channel, and sometimes I just want to read them for fun. So in this video, I'll share with you some of the books that I have loved recently. And if you're interested in reading any of these for yourself, I encourage you to check out your local library first, then a local bookshop, but you can also find Amazon links to all of these items in the description box below if that's more your jam. You'll also find a link to a document where I've compiled all my previously reviewed books. Since we've all got pandemics in mind, let's start with the Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest plague in history by John M. Barry. This is a 500-plus page account of the influenza pandemic of 1918, often called the Spanish flu, and allegedly, this is the book that inspired President George W. Bush to take pandemic preparedness more seriously. In the book, Barry focuses on the epidemiology and progress of the disease itself from the spring of 1918 through the tail end into the 1920s, but he also details the response from United States health professionals. To do that, he actually starts the story in the late 1800s with the founding of Johns Hopkins Medical School, since so many of the leading scientists came from Hopkins back then. From there, he goes into detail about everything. It's a deep dive of the pandemic, including how we identified cases, how scientists learned about influenza despite having never seen a virus before, and how different countries responded to the pandemic, albeit the focus is on the United States. Right away, I loved this book for its depth. I've read multiple articles during the last year and a half that mention 1918 or compare something about COVID to the influenza pandemic, but they're all usually pretty superficial. They wore masks and social distance in 1918. Crazy, right? Which, that's cool for a general audience, but I'm a little nerdier than the average reader. Tell me something new. To me, the most interesting part about this book was how it walks you through the entire timeline. Back in 19, we were starting to realize that vaccines had huge potential against infectious diseases, and developing vaccines back then required scientists to isolate the disease-causing germ, culture it, then figure out a way to kill it or attenuate it. Scientists in 1918 failed at the very first step. They rolled out an ineffective vaccine against a bacteria, not the virus that causes influenza. I'll do a whole video, probably multiple videos, summarizing this book someday because it is so packed with information. It took me about a month to get through, so I recommend this book if you want a history to really sink your teeth into. Continuing the theme of books about disease outbreaks, I really enjoyed The Ghost Map by Stephen Johnson. It tells the story of the 1854 cholera epidemic in London, which, if you watch this channel, you might know was the one where John Snow found that folks who got their water from the Broad Street pump in London tended to get cholera more often than people who got their water from other wells. So he got the city to shut down the pump, and cholera cases fell soon afterwards. It's often credited as the start of the field of epidemiology. That simplified version of this story has been told so many times, especially during COVID. I read this book to give me as much context as possible around this important moment in medical history, and in my opinion, it delivered on that. How did plumbing systems in London allow for wells to harbor cholera in the first place? What kind of information distribution systems needed to be in place for scientists to collect preliminary data? And how did the information from the epidemic get implemented into law? Because I'm sure it wasn't as easy as just listening to the scientists. The Ghost Map covers all of these questions, and it gave me the context I needed to understand this moment in history. Since this book is trying to make sense of all the context together, it doesn't follow a strictly chronological order. Instead, it explains the factors at play and then ties them together into the greater story. It's a great balance between an engaging story as well as thorough explanations that help us understand the context. And since the Broad Street pump story is likely familiar to a larger audience, the Ghost Map offers an accessible, deep dive while still being shallow enough to keep you from drowning in historical records. I'd recommend this book to people starting to get into the history of medicine. It's a nice, easy foot in the door. Next up is The Ice Pick Surgeon by Sam Kean. It's a collection of stories about how scientists have done immoral things in the name of science. It starts off with a story about a man named William Dampier who wanted to travel the world to study natural history and biology, but he had no way of financing his expedition. So what are you going to do if you're in that situation? Become a pirate. When the rest of the crew was out plundering, he was collecting specimens and writing about nature. But he wasn't 100% innocent. He for sure did his fair share of pirate stuff. This book is split between stories about people, like the titular ice pick surgeon, and stories about more general practices, like science done on enslaved people. Keene covers practices that have been central to the history of medicine too, like vivisection and grave robbing, so it's super topical for this channel. The standout story to me, though, was the story of the first attempted execution by electric chair, and how it evolved from the scientific feud between Edison and Tesla. Now, given the heavy topics, I was worried that this book would be too preachy to enjoy, but Keene centers a specific story or example within the greater topic, and the chapters are an engaging narrative as opposed to just a 20-page essay about, like, the bad thing from history was bad. For example, he covers vivisection in the context of Edison's work on electricity, and explains the practice of grave robbing by telling the story of Burke and Hare. Plus, Keene was able to switch up his tone between professional, respectful, or grave depending on the situation, and that kind of variety kept the book interesting while covering a range of topics. The Ice Pick Surgeon is my current pick for the best new science book of 2021. It only came out a little bit ago. But I also wanted to give a shout out to one of Keene's older books, The Disappearing Spoon. It's a history of every element on the periodic table, and has some applications to the history of medicine, so you might find it interesting too. Sam Keene, well done. Thank you for the month of reading with these two books. Next up is Brains Explained by Dr. Ali Caldwell and Micah Caldwell, which you might know as Neurotransmissions on YouTube. If you're unfamiliar, Ali has a PhD in neuroscience and Micah is a therapist, and on their channel they talk about brains. Ali from the neuro perspective, Micah from the psychology perspective. And their book, like their videos, tells stories from the history of their fields and explains the topics within them. But what I personally like about the book is that it is so good at packing a lot of stories into a small space. They mentioned on a live stream that they had to condense a lot of information and cut some sections so that the book didn't get too big. And when you do that, you run the risk of oversimplifying the story or leaving out interesting context that brings emotion and consequence into the story. A great example, I made a video about concussion that was 22 minutes long, and I feel like that was the shortest that video could have been. I know how much harder it is to condense a story than to extend it, but the stories in Brains Explained spend just enough time giving you the background, introducing the case study or scientist, then detailing the story. As far as what kinds of stories, you can expect some familiar characters like Phineas Gage or Freud, but also stories about female scientists and scientists of color that I had never heard before. I'm going to give a special recommendation of Brains Explained to kids in 6th grade or higher. There are some mature themes like sex, addiction, and mental illness, which are expected from a neuroscientist and therapist, but these topics are presented from professionals with an appropriate amount of respect and accessibility. This is the kind of book I wish I had when I was younger to help me understand my body, but more importantly, help me understand my brain. Brains Explained, accessible explanations, and well-told stories. Let's continue the neuroscience theme with Awakenings by Oliver Sacks, who's an absolute legend. Over his career, he earned a reputation for being empathetic at a time when medicine was growing impersonal and analytic, and for writing these beautiful case studies. I came across this book because I was contracted to write and host a video about Oliver's life for Seeker, a YouTube channel that I work for. Long story short, a company made a documentary about Oliver's life and contracted Seeker to make some content that promoted the documentary. That meant that I had to research Oliver's career and pull out some kind of story that I thought was interesting, and that's when I came across Awakenings. This book is a collection of case studies that Oliver performed in the 1960s with patients who suffered from a neurological disease called encephalitis lethargica. It was kind of like Parkinson's disease, but even more mysterious. Fortunately, around that time, doctors were starting to have some luck reducing Parkinson's symptoms with a drug called levodopa. So Oliver eventually decided to run a small experiment where he gave levodopa to his patients, and it was a huge success. They saw immediate improvements in everything: movement, speech, cognition, all of it, which made it seem like this was a miracle drug. Oliver wrote everything up and submitted his work to be published in scientific journals, but was rejected by every single one of them. Instead, he decided to add a little bit of prose into his reports and publish his series as this book. So I ordered this book and I read it as part of the research for the Seeker video. And I'm glad I did, because Oliver's personality comes through in his writing. I felt like I was getting to know him. And that struck me as counterintuitive because Awakenings took the form of an academic paper. It has an introduction, gives relevant background for the layperson reader, it details the methods and the results, and then goes into the cases one by one. But because Oliver wasn't restricted by academia, he added a ton of background and narrative and turned his research into a legit story. The bulk of the book takes a chapter to describe each patient in depth, but I was more interested in the background and conclusions. And to be honest, Oliver isn't remembered for discovering anything revolutionary, but for how he humanized his patients. And reading the comments section of that Seeker video showed me how much people admired his empathy and approach as a doctor. It was one of those rare videos where I felt good reading the YouTube comments section. Awakenings might not be the best fit for general history of medicine fans since it's essentially a repurposed academic study, but if you're interested in neurology or if you're a med school hopeful, this book provides a great example of what it's like to care for real human beings and treat them with empathy. Switching gears, The King's Anatomist by Dr. Ron Blumenfeld, which is the first historical fiction I've ever reviewed. I'm not usually into this genre, but this book is about Andreas Vesalius, who is one of my personal favorite figures in the history of medicine. Vesalius is often remembered for his contributions to the field of anatomy, but he died a mysterious death while traveling to the Holy Land, and that's where this book picks up. The story starts with Vesalius's fictional best friend reading his final letters, but he recognizes that something isn't quite right. From there, the story takes detours that dive deeper into Vesalius's life and personality, and provides details that humanize him. Like, there's a line in the book where Vesalius is designing his house and decides to model his door knocker after a femur and acetabulum. And that might have been a footnote somewhere, but Dr. Blumenfeld takes that footnote and brings you there. You're also brought into conversations between a young Vesalius and his fictional best friend Jan as they plan to steal a corpse for dissection, and we get to hear how Vesalius might have reacted to seeing drawings from Da Vinci firsthand. As a Vesalius nerd, it was fun to see characters and moments that I had researched show up in this book. The best comparison I can make is when you watch the Star Wars prequels for the first time and you see references to a young Boba Fett or Luke Skywalker. You're like, oh, he's a kid now, but he grows up to be a big deal. My brain knew the significance of those Vesalius characters and knew what it might foreshadow. I know historical fiction can be hit or miss, but for Vesalius, I was into it. This book is available for pre-order now, and it should be out by October 2021. Next is Heart, A History by Sandeep Jahar. This was half memoir, half history of cardiology. It talked about everything from William Harvey's work of cardiovascular anatomy all the way through to modern tools like echoes, stents, and artificial valves. The history struck a good balance between depth and brevity, which is appropriate for a book trying to distill all of cardiology into one source. But to introduce all of these concepts, Dr. Jahar tells personal stories about his relationship with cardiovascular disease, like when his grandfather died suddenly of a heart attack, or when he dealt with a patient who only treated himself with magnets. I personally wasn't a huge fan of the memoir style. I felt like the only thing connecting the memoir to the history was the fact that Jahar is a cardiologist, and that felt distracting at times. I mean, he's probably a great guy, but with a title like Heart, A History, I was expecting more history and less of the author. There was one section from the memoir that I did find moving, though, from when he was in the university cadaver lab. Our ponytailed professor had us do an exercise. What could we surmise about our cadavers? He asked, with an external inspection. What clues were available about how they might have lived or died? It was a fascinating exercise, a reminder to us aspiring doctors that even as we tried to figure out how our cadavers had died, we should not forget to think about how they might have lived. Reflect on their lives, our professor intoned, even as you cut. I took note of that. As someone who teaches anatomy on the internet, that section was a concise way to encourage respect for the body. And overall, this book was a good read. I learned a lot and I had a good reading experience. I'd recommend this one for a more general audience, though. It's much lighter than The Great Influenza or The Ghost Map from earlier, but still appropriate for people who like reading about doctors and medicine. On the other hand, The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green also uses a memoir in the narrative. The difference is that I already care about John as a person from consuming his work for so many years. While you might know John from Crash Course or The Fault in Our Stars, he also writes a podcast called The Anthropocene Reviewed, where he reviews different aspects of the human-centered world on a 5-star scale. For instance, Diet Dr. Pepper gets 4 stars, while Plague gets 1 star. This book is a compilation of essays he's written for the podcast, but also a bunch of new ones. And there's a surprising amount of medical history in this book, including an intro about labyrinthitis, and chapters where John reviews Staphylococcus aureus, viral meningitis, and plague. This is easily the least academic book on my list, but I'm including it because, first and foremost, I liked reading it, and 2, books about medical history treat scientists and doctors as the main characters all the time. In The Anthropocene Reviewed, John has this incredible ability to connect the reader to the person suffering from disease. He uses his gift of language to make you empathize with the sufferer, which is something that an understanding of biology just can't replicate. The Anthropocene Reviewed is a delightful book that made me feel hope, pride, and connection with other humans in a time when that's harder than ever. I give the Anthropocene Reviewed 5 stars. The final book on my list was a surprise last-minute addition, Anti-Vaxxers: How to Challenge a Misinformed Movement by Jonathan Berman. I initially picked it up because I thought it would be a compilation of ways to talk to vaccine-hesitant people, but in reality, half of it was a history of the anti-vaccine movement, while the rest was a bunch of talking points and tips for productive communication. Of course, it starts with Jenner and the smallpox vaccine, but it also tells stories about pushback to vaccine mandates and the rollout of some of the vaccines around the turn of the 20th century. It wasn't what I was expecting, but looking back on it, I'm glad that this book is more story-based than argument-based. Because when I talk to people about vaccines in real life, I tend to give lots of context about why science does things and how we got here. So this book gave me even more context to bring into conversation. And that itself is practical. Like, I'm sure you've heard this already, but people don't change their stance on vaccination based on data or numbers. But a few of them might be persuaded by stories or by appealing to their identities and values. And when I meet someone like that, the stories in this book are what I want to talk about now. Not because I want to create a gotcha moment, but because I want to empathize with them and figure out where their skepticism is coming from. The author did most of his writing from 2018 to 2019, and he published a few months into the pandemic in 2020, before the mRNA vaccines were available. But so many of the talking points from history apply to people's concerns today, so even though it doesn't mention modern conspiracy theories about this round of vaccines, it's still relevant. I recommend this one both because it's an interesting story, but also because these stories are a practical tool. They may help you understand where people are coming from and how to empathize with them, and then change their minds and convince them to get vaccinated. Real quick, before you go, I plan on doing one of these book review videos every few months, and I'm always looking for recommendations of what to read next. So please tell me about some of your favorite medical history books down in the comment section below. Chances are that you're going to find some good suggestions down there for yourself. As always, thank you to my patrons, and thank you for watching.